page 21. Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, by David Benatar, 2006. Chapter 1. 1.2. Antinatalism and the pro-natal bias. I shall argue that one implication of the view that coming into existence is always a serious harm is that we should not have children. Some anti-natalist positions are founded on either a dislike of children or on the interests of adults who have greater freedom and resources if they do not have and rear children. My anti-natalist view is different. It arises, not from a dislike of children, but instead from a concern to avoid the suffering of potential children and the adults they would become, even if not having those children runs counter to the interests of those who would have them. Anti-natalist views, whatever their source, run up against an extremely powerful pro-natalist bias. This bias has its roots in the evolutionary origins of human, and more primitive animal, psychology and biology. Those with pro-natal views are more likely to pass on their genes. It is part of the pro-natal bias that most people simply assume that passing on one's genes is both good and a sign of superiority. With different moral views, however, survival, either of the self or of one's genes, might not be seen as an indication of being better. The pro-natal bias manifests itself in many ways. For example, there is the assumption that one should get married or simply cohabit in order to produce children, and that, infertility aside, one is either backward or selfish if one does not. Sometimes the presumption is betrayed by the word yet, as in have you had children yet? This assumption does not usually extend to both male and female homosexuals who do not have children, although homosexuals, whether or not they have children, are often the victims of a more vicious opprobrium. They are often regarded as perverted or disgusting rather than backward or selfish. The assumption of a backwardness draws on an ontogenetic or individual developmental paradigm. Children do not have children, but adults do. Thus, if one has not yet started breeding, one is not fully adult. But it is far from clear that this is the appropriate paradigm. First, knowing when not to have a baby and having the self-control to follow through with this is a sign of maturity, not immaturity. There are all too many pubescent children who are having children without being adequately prepared to rear them. Second, is a related point. From a phylogenetic perspective, the impulse to procreation is extremely primitive. If a backward is understood as a primitive, it is procreation that is backward, and rationally motivated non-procreation that is evolutionarily more recent and advanced. Although non-procreation is sometimes, as I indicated above, motivated by selfish concerns, it need not be. Where people refrain from procreating in order to avoid inflicting the harm of coming into existence, their motives are altruistic, not selfish. Moreover, any self-consciously altruistic motivation to have children is thoroughly misguided where the intended beneficiaries are the children, and, as I shall argue, inappropriate where they are other people or the state. In some communities there is considerable peer and other social pressure to produce babies, and sometimes even as many babies as possible. This can occur even when parents are unable to take adequate care of the large number of children they are producing. Nor are the pressures always informal. Governments not infrequently intervene, particularly, but not only, when birth rates decline, in order to encourage baby making. This is true even where the baseline population is already high and the concern is only about birth rates falling beneath that of replacement. Here the concern is that there will be fewer people of working age and thus fewer taxpayers to support a larger aging population. I shall say more in Chapter 7 about the costs to existing people of a decreased birth rate. In the specific case of Japan, to which I shall now refer, not everybody agrees that the population decline will impact very adversely on Japanese society. See, For example, The Incredible Shrinking Country, The Economist, November 13, 2004, 45A6. For example, in Japan there were concerns that the birth rate of 1.33 children would reduce the population of 127 million people to 101 million in 2050 and 64 million by 2100. The Japanese government took action. They launched the A+1 plan, aimed at persuading married couples to have one extra child, and established the Anti-Low Birth Rate Measures Promotion Headquarters to coordinate the plan. One of the proposals in the plan was a yen 3.1 billion matchmaking budget to be spent on publicly funded parties, boat cruises, and hiking trips for single men and women. The government also pledged financial support for couples seeking expensive fertility treatment. The A+1 plan also had provision for diverting resources to provide education loans to put children through school. Singapore developed plans to persuade citizens to produce more children. In addition to propaganda, it introduced financial incentives to have a third child, paid maternity leave, and state-funded child care centers. And Australia has announced a $13.3 billion family package to be distributed over 5 years. According to that country's treasurer, if you can have children, it's a good thing to do. In addition to having one child for the husband and one for the wife, he urged Australians also to have one for their country. It is well known that totalitarian regimes often encourage people, if not coerce or force them into baby-making for military reasons, given the desire for new, plentiful generations of soldiers. Crudely put, this is pro-natalism for cannon fodder. Democracies, particularly those not involved in protracted conflict, are not and need not be so crude, but this, as we have seen, does not mean that they are devoid of pro-natalism. Even where democracies take no formal steps to increase the birth rate, we should note that democracy has an inherent bias towards pro-natalism. Given that the majority prevails, even if within certain liberal constraints, each sector of a democracy's population is incentivized to produce extra offspring in order for its interests and agendas either to prevail or at least to hold their own. Notice, by extension, that in a democracy those committed to non-procreation could never, in the long run, prevail politically against those committed to procreation. Moreover, it is curious how democracy favors breeding over immigration. Offspring have a presumed right to citizenship, while potential immigrants do not. Imagine a polarized state consisting of two opposing ethnic groups. One increases its size by breeding and the other by immigration. Depending on who holds power, the group that grows by immigration will either be prevented from growing or it will be accused of colonialism. But why should democracy favor one indigenous group over another merely because one breeds rather than increases by immigration? Why should breeding be unlimited but immigration curtailed where political outcomes are equally sensitive to both ways of enhancing population? Some may seek to answer this question by arguing that a right to procreative freedom is more important than a right to immigrate. That may indeed be an accurate description of the way a law actually works, but we can question whether that is the way it should be. Should somebody's freedom to create a person be more inviolable than somebody else's freedom to have a friend or family member immigrate? Another way in which pro-natalism operates, even in the moral, and not merely the political, realm is that breeders enhance their value by having children. Parents with dependents are somehow thought to count for more. If, for example, there is some scarce reserve, see a donor kidney perhaps, and of the two potential recipients one is a parent of young children and one is not, the parent, all things being equal, will likely be favored. To let a parent die is not only to thwart that person's preference to be saved, but also the preferences of his or her children that their parent be saved. It is quite true, of course, that the death of the parent will harm more people, but there is nonetheless something to be said against favoring parents. Increasing one's value by having children might be like increasing one's value by taking hostages. We might find it unfair and decide not to reward it. That may make children's lives worse, but must the cost of preventing that outcome be placed on the shoulders of those who do not have children? None of the above is to deny that there are some societies in which anti-natal policies have been adopted. The most obvious example is China, where the government introduced a one-child-per-couple policy. A few points are noteworthy, however. First, such policies are exceptional. Secondly, they are a response to massive, rather than merely moderate, overpopulation. Thirdly, they are required precisely because they are a corrective to a very powerful pro-natal bias, and thus do not constitute a refutation of the existence of such bias. Nor do I deny that there are some non-state critics of pro-natalism. There are those, for example, who argue that one's life is better or at least no worse without children, and there are those who object to the discrimination against people who are either infertile or child-free by choice. As welcome as this opposition to pro-natalism is, most of it is inspired by concern for existing people. Very rarely do we hear criticism of pro-natalism based on what procreation does to those who are brought into existence. There is one kind of exception, those who believe that the world is too horrible a place into which to bring children. Such people believe that there happens to be too much bad in the world to make procreation acceptable. That belief must be right. I disagree only in one way with those who advance it. Unlike most of them, I think that there could be much less suffering and yet procreation would remain unacceptable. On my view, there is no net benefit to coming into existence, and thus coming into existence is never worth its costs. I know that that view is hard to accept. I shall defend it in some detail in Chapter 2. Sound though I believe my argument to be, I cannot but hope that I am wrong. Page 26.